It smells spicy, it smells funky, let's give it a go.
Radio Free Infinite episode 288, talking about a band that never got the attention I feel that they deserved, even in their heyday. Averse Sefira, possibly most notable for having the most brutal corpse paint I've ever seen. It's like this weird, intricate bramble of black hatch marks. Got to be a pain in the ass to apply that before every show. Funny story about that, a long time ago, back when I was more sociable with other members of the human species, a fella asked me, "Hey, Jub, what's your favorite corpse paint?" And I say, well, it's got to be from Averse Sefira. I mean, that just looks cool. And he's like, oh, okay. Then like a week later, he sends me this painting of Jub from Morrowind in the Sanguine Mapsama corpse paint. And I was like,
holy Jesus.
dude, you didn't have to do that. I felt bad. I should have said something easy like, I don't know, Abbott or something. I mean, if you're listening to this right now, thanks, guy. That was above and beyond. I think of one of only 2 unsolicited pieces of fan art I have received over the years. Appreciated bigly. But just what the heck is an Averse Sefira? Well, Sefira is the singular form of the old Hebrew word Sephiroth. And I'm not talking about the Final Fantasy character.
Weeaboos go to Japan and be like, where are the subtitles?
Have you ever seen that wacky Kabbalah tree-looking diagram? That's what the circles connected by the lines are. It's supposed to be 10 divine emanations or angels shooting out of the right and left hands of God. So an Averse Sefira would obviously be the opposite of that. Some sort of evil emanation. So basically, it's like standard black metal type stuff, but with more steps, while simultaneously being both more mystical and more transgressive. To quote the band themselves, we have taken these Averse Sephiroth and extrapolated them as narrative vehicles for our tales of mythic irony.
I'm not stupid.
And that sort of high-minded lyrical approach definitely fits their musical material, which even on their hoary old 1997 demo Blasphemet Scene Abset was incredibly sophisticated. In addition to having Rathsaterial Diabolus on bassist and Sanguine Mopsima on guitars, along with later on the drummer, solely bemonikered as The Carcass, Averse Sefira also had sort of a hidden 4th guest member in the form of an individual called the Lady of the Evening Faces, who made all these cool, weird little ambient interlude type things for them entirely out of found sounds and tape loops, no keyboards to speak of. The black metal proper, when it gets around to kicking in, honestly has a whole lot of death metal, as you're hearing, with this rather percussive riff set, leading into one of their trademark long-winded tremolo pick sections that are very bendy and have all sorts of turnabouts and architectonic melodic arches, to the point where I think that even in the demo stage, Averse Sefira stacks up favorably against a lot of European black metal bands of the era, despite the fact that they are
from the state of Texas.
They'd definitely been listening to their old school Immortal and their old school Graveland records when they were writing this stuff. And that slightly more epic and technical take on traditional black metal would continue onto their first album, 1999's Homecoming's March, which showed off their fondness for pairing very Wagnerian sounding, bassy melodic riffs with these very strange, almost bright sounding chord riffs that utilize a lot of very dissonant and ugly sounding tones, but actually end up being rather beautiful sounding. Kind of like they're using their own weird theoretical music language. They always sounded very symphonic to me without actually utilizing any keyboards. Part of that just comes from how thoroughly these songs are composed, with each part leading into the next in a very logical sort of way. So even if there is a potent death metal influence, I would say at its heart this music is still black metal in terms of its focus on these overlapping melodic layers. It's very majestic and almost kind of pompous sounding, which definitely fits with their lyrical concepts and especially with their very distinctive album art. And here we come to one of the first common misconceptions about Averse Sefira, because usually when you hear, oh, they're using dissonant chords in metal, they got to be influenced by Voivod, right?
No!
In fact, they actually addressed this question in a couple different interviews from back in the day that I remember. They said that they weren't really into Voivod at all, and that dissonant component of their music probably came from the fact that one of their primary goals as a band was essentially to be a black metal version of the death metal band Immolation. And when you listen to the more epic moments of especially like mid-90s Immolation, you can definitely hear that in Averse Sefira's music. Incidentally, I think that Averse Sefira's like lyrical bent kind of fits that sort of Immolation aesthetic better than Immolation's own lyrical content does. Immolation tends to go for more of just like an angrily atheistic ideological bent compared to the weird mysticism of an Averse Sefira, which I honestly think suits the music and the visual aesthetics a little better.
Take care, Arbiter. What you say is heresy.
But that's just one man's opinion. Point is, they've explicitly stated they are not influenced by Voivod, and they are influenced by Immolation, which becomes even more noticeable when you get to their second album, Battles Clarion, which for me at least, I kind of consider to be the first real Averse Sefira masterpiece. Namely because they finally got this fellow named the Carcass on drums, instead of just a drum machine set to the blast set. I mean, occasionally the drum programming on the earlier Averse Sefira stuff could be kind of clever, but the way the Carcass locks in with the various and sundry changes in guitar riffs with his own wacky drum fills and whatnot really adds an even more epic sense of majesty to the music and underscores its expansive nature, particularly during the more dramatically unfolding sections like the one you're listening to right now. And boy, does it ever unfold into some weird shit.
Bloody hell, I'm feeling a little.
Very odd, slow, bendy sort of riff, complete with a more thorough integration of the Lady of the Evening Faces' ambient stuff, no longer just relegated to interludes, but rather kind of weaving its way into the music in totality. And here we come to the debunking of the second major misconception about Averse Sefira's music, because
I know what you're thinking.
so ain't that just some Deathspell Omega shit?
It's not.
So back when Averse Sefira was really going strong, I was a massive fan of these guys. In fact, they were probably my favorite active black metal band along with Summoning at the time. Like, I was even willing to put up with a Dork funeral concert to see these guys. And during that time, I read basically every interview that they put out, wherein they talked about bands that they were into and bands that they were influenced by, and not once did they ever mention Deathspell Omega, which lines up with the fact that they had this weird dissonant black metal sound way back in the early 2000s, before Deathspell Omega had their big style change. They were, however, influenced by bands like Antaeus and early Funeral Mist, who definitely also did influence Deathspell Omega, which is probably where some of the confusion comes from. But what's more interesting, the bands that they don't mention in interviews are the bands that they do. Specifically two bands, 1349 who I've always seen as being rather, unfortunately, underrated by the black metal scene as a whole in lieu of a lot of lesser bands, at least in regards to their first three albums, which I think are all fantastic, and certainly better than anything Dark Funeral or Marduk has ever done.
Damn, that's hateful!
The second band that they mentioned that I thought was kind of interesting was the similarly underrated Russian black metal band, Old Waynes. Who Sanguine specifically pointed out as an influence on his vocal technique, as well as their penchant for lengthy, blasting, dissonant, yet beautiful tremolo riffs. And you can definitely hear shades of that sort of thing peeking through as far back as the second Averse Sefira album. I mean, that riff do be sounding pretty majestic, if I do say so myself. And I do. And like all good Averse Sefira 1-2 punches, it's followed up with a much more tense-sounding melodic phrase. Averse Sefira really does kind of stick out from the United States black metal of its day. They tend to go for a much more expansive sort of sound, as opposed to either being very depressive one-man kind of stuff, or ultra-blasphemous death metal influence material. You know, think of Zaster for the former and Profanatica for the latter. Although they are certainly capable of reaching the heights of blasting heaviness comparable to a death metal band. I mean, that's some Frost level blast beats right there. That's that good shit. Quality drumsmanship there, Mr. The Carcass. So earlier I mentioned this was like the first real big classic Averse Sefira album. It follows that the album after it, Tetragrammatical Astigmata, would be the second masterpiece. This was the first Averse Sefira I ever heard, probably only a few months after it came out when I was in high school. And as soon as I put it on, I was like, hell yeah! I can even remember the specific moment on the album that made them one of my favorite black metal bands, and it was on the delightfully titled song, Cremation of Ideologies. Now, it's not right at the beginning of the song, although that is a banger too, with that weird fucking riff and those nasty goddamn vocals. But no, to get to the real good shit, you gotta work your way through this maze of complex riff structures before you hit the song's first real epic break. That's when the goodness happens. Right here. This whole melodic sequence, easily within the upper echelon of quality black metal riffage. And if you're into black metal and you don't want to check out more of Averse Sefira after hearing that part, I don't know what the fuck to tell you.
Get out of here!
The only reason you posers wouldn't like this band is because they're American instead of European.
And that's the bottom line.
Whereas Battle's Clarion was pretty short and immediate, really went right for the throat. Tetragrammatical Astigmata is a lot more expansive and epic, and it also brings back a little bit more of that death metal influence they had on their earliest demos. Definitely can hear that sort of epic kind of immolation style shit going on there. But they also reference another Asian band,
Light 'em up.
with a very Chris Richards from Suffocation style bass fill. That they do a really interesting job of tying back into the larger black metal context with this odd sort of evil waltzing kind of riff. Definitely another major standout moment on the album for me. A whole lot of weird mini melodies within melodies kind of overlapping each other. And the riff they followed up with is a really good bit of counterpoint as well. I would say Tetragrammatical Astigmata might be the best place to start your Averse Sefira collection with. I mean, it's definitely what got me into them. It's accessible enough production-wise, but it's also probably their most complex and interesting music released to date. That date, of course, being in 2005, because the album that came after this in 2008, the final Averse Sefira album, makes Tetragrammatical Astigmata look like 2 + 2. And it's even more of a special release for me personally, because it's the first album that came out after I had already been a fan of them. So it's kind of like their... for me in that regard.
앞머리 안 자를 거예요.
Yeah, that's the big scandal. I didn't exactly get into the Twice thing on the ground floor. First heard Likey in like late 2018. By then it was already more than a year old. But I definitely was one of the OG Advent Parallax enjoyers. Because I actually went to the record store the day this came out. Bought it, walked home, threw it in the CD player like...
Yeah, buddy.
And guess what? It was probably their best shit they ever wrote. Certainly their most thoughtful sounding release, at least in my ears. They brought in a whole lot of new compositional innovations. Like this one coming up right here, I like to call it a hold your breath sort of moment, where they hang on one unresolved musical phrase for a bit before immediately bringing the hammer down with an opposing yet complementary set of riffs. This kind of shit's all over the album, and when they do it the second time in this song, it's an excellent opportunity for them to introduce an even better version of that kind of riff I enjoyed so much on Cremation of Ideology. That's a sexy black metal riff right there. Absolute pinnacle of the art form. And the follow-up kind of closeout bit is amazing too, with these shuddering walls of dissonant chords starting to reveal something rather surprising. It's sort of an almost early Emperor style, arpeggiated sort of black metal lead guitar line. Really sharply written stuff. And it's not all just like crazy blasting shit either. I mean, there's plenty of that, but this is also sort of like the most Burzamic they ever got, where they have these really long and repetitive yet not boring phrases because they're so complex and kind of winding and twisting back on each other. Almost downright ambient sounding, especially for Averse Sefira. But there's still a little bit of death metal in how they kind of jump riff to riff, even in these really long, winding ambient sort of sections, which I think helps keep them interesting. Because even at their most subtle, they'll still throw in a little bit more of an obvious riff change-up, as opposed to continuing to overlay the drone. They've also clearly put a lot of care into how the vocals link up with the music going on underneath in a rhythmic sense. That too has always been like a pretty noticeable feature of Averse Sefira, but it's especially in your face with that sort of thing on this album in particular. Real solid black metal album overall. There's a whole lot of highlights, including sort of an interesting guest vocalist trade-off with Ross Dolan from Immolation on the penultimate song, Refractions of an Unexploded Singularity. I covered that in detail 3 years ago on episode 125, which was all about Immolation. But my personal favorite song of this album would have to be the closing track, Vomitorium Angelus.
Well, that just happened.
I know that's not what a vomitorium is. Please be sure to call me an idiot in the comments anyways. The intro to this song actually features my favorite work ever from the Lady of the Evening Faces, with these weird noisy sounds kind of resolving into sort of an orchestral overture that actually acts as the introduction of the song's main melodic motif. And what a melody it is. Maybe my favorite Averse Sefira riff of all time. Definitely gives off that air of decayed majesty that they've always been going for with their aesthetics and the cover art. And the counterpoint riff to it is a pretty massive turnaround, but the Carcass's weird kind of tribal drumming sort of holds it all together rhythmically, which is helpful because this song also contains some of the weirdest shit Averse Sefira ever wrote. Like this fucking bit right here, that's some fucking, I don't even know what that is. It's worth noting that they mentioned the bizarre avant-garde Norwegian death metal band Cadaver as an influence. I think you can hear it with parts like that. This song's built primarily around the contrast between this melody you're hearing right here and that opening melody, the really majestic sounding one, before they finally draw the curtain on it with sort of a more minimalist black metal section. And this also kind of draws the curtain on their career because they toured on this album for 4 years and then broke up in 2012, which I remember being pretty bummed out by because I had been reading Sanguine Mopsama's blog about the band for several years at that point. The bassist, Wrath's Ethereal Diabolus, aka Jeff Tandy, of course went on to be in the reformed version of Imprecation, as I went over back on the Blaspherian episode. He's also in a death metal band called Trenchant that, you know, it is death metal, but it has a little bit of a Averse Sefira feeling to it at times. If you're a nerd, you might call it blackened death metal, I guess. Whatever it is, pretty good album. And funnily enough, also has guest appearances from Immolation. In this case, good old Bob Vigna doing some solos on it, in addition to the fella from Odium Totus. He had another band, too, that actually had the Carcass on drums, called Birth AD, that weren't Averse Sefira adjacent or really black metal at all. Instead, it was sort of an interesting response to the onset of retro thrash, in that it's heavily influenced by fellow Texans DRI.
Holy dog shit, Texas!
And it kind of takes the youthful disaffectedness of that band's lyrical content and ages it into sort of a harder-edged misanthropy.
Equal opportunity to piss your time away. You'll always have security if you show up every day. Equal opportunity is a hamster on a wheel. Stick it out for long enough and you'll forget to feel.
Sometimes it gets downright James Mason-esque.
Rob the house, steal a gun, go to school and shoot everyone. Fuck things up, such you can. Don't be a part of their master plan. That's problems.
Whatever it is, it definitely sodomizes municipal waste. But the main guy from Averse Sefira, good old Sanguine Mopsama, the man who I said had the greatest corpse paint of all time, he hasn't done anything musically since the breakup of Averse Sefira, as far as I can tell, which is a damn shame because he was really good at what he did, and Averse Sefira was one of the best bands ever. But hey, I guess they went out on top with one great album and 3 masterpieces, even a pretty good demo. A whole hell of a lot better than most black metal bands are doing. And hopefully you enjoyed learning about them. Thanks for watching or listening to whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
We saw snot hanging out of your nose while you were eating food. We're gonna steal that photo and call you a gross piece of shit. 私は